Joan of Arc. You know the name, right? It's legendary. But the story most of us think we know? Well, it barely scratches the surface. She's been called a saint, a heretic, a heroine, but behind all those myths was a real person who did something that should have been impossible. So today we're going to peel back the layers of legend and figure out what she actually did.
And that really is the million-dollar question, isn't it? How did this happen? I mean, let's put the myths aside for a second. How does a teenage girl who can't read or write, from some tiny, remote village, wind up in command of a royal army and actually turn the tide of a massive war? The answer, which a lot of stories surprisingly gloss over, is that she was an absolutely brilliant military commander.
I mean, just look at the sheer range of labels people have thrown at her. Over the centuries, so many different groups have tried to claim her. Nationalists, the church, feminists, you name it. She's been painted as everything from a divine messenger of God to a deluded madwoman. This massive conflict over who she was is really at the heart of her entire story.
Now, to really get why Joan's arrival was such a game changer, you have to understand the absolute rock-bottom desperation of France in 1429. The situation wasn't just bad, it was a full-blown catastrophe. The entire kingdom was literally on the verge of disappearing for good.
By the time Joan shows up on the scene, France had been torn apart by nearly 100 years of war with England. After a crushing defeat at Agincourt, a treaty was signed that handed the French crown to the English king. This meant the rightful French heir, the Dauphin Charles, was basically a king with no kingdom on the run. The English and their allies controlled almost all of northern France, and by 1428, they were at the gates of Orléans, the last domino that needed to fall for them to conquer the whole country.
But you know, the deepest wound wasn't actually military, it was psychological. The French army that was still loyal to the Dauphin was just completely demoralized. This deep, profound sense of defeat had settled in. They had totally lost the will to fight. You had entire cities just surrendering because they knew no help was ever coming.
And the final breaking point, the absolute low, came just before Joan's arrival. It was a fight known as the Battle of the Herrings. A French and Scottish force of about 4,000 soldiers tried to ambush a much smaller English supply convoy. And even though they outnumbered them almost 3-1, they were completely routed. The defeat was so humiliating that the French commander, just disgusted, quit the field. Morale in the city of Orléans just collapsed, and the Dauphin himself was reportedly thinking about giving up and fleeing the country.
So it's into this moment of total, absolute despair that our unlikely hero steps onto the stage. Just when all hope seems lost, a teenage girl from a village you've never heard of shows up, claiming she's on a mission from God. And look, this isn't just something people said later on. The commander of the forces in Orléans, a seasoned general, a guy they called the Bastard of Orléans, he said this himself. He was there. He saw her arrive, he saw what happened next, and he was convinced he was watching something that just wasn't humanly possible. But here's the thing. She didn't just show up and take over. No way. There was a whole process. First, she had to convince the skeptical local captain that her divine visions were real. Then, she traveled for 11 days across hostile enemy territory to get to the Dauphin's court. He, of course, was skeptical too, so he had her examined for weeks by a whole panel of theologians. It was only after she passed every single test that the desperate Dauphin finally said, okay, let's give her a shot, and entrusted her with an army to go save Orléans.
And what she did next, well, this is the military achievement that's at the very heart of her legend. The English had been sitting outside Orléans for 7 long months, slowly tightening their grip, just strangling the city. What happened next was one of the most incredible turnarounds in military history.
7 months. The professional English army had been there, building forts, digging trenches, and getting ready to starve the city out. Joan of Arc broke the entire siege in 7 days. Here's how she did it.
The pace she set was just relentless. On May 4th, she leads an assault that captures the fort of St. Loup. 2 days later, they storm and take the fortified monastery of the Augustines. And then on May 7th, they go for the main prize, the Tourelles, this massive English fortress complex that controlled the city's main bridge.
On the night before that final, most dangerous assault, Joan made a prediction to her confessor that is just chillingly specific. She seemed to know, somehow, that the next day was going to be the big one, and that she herself was going to be wounded in the fight.
And her prediction came true. Early in the assault on the Tourelles, as she's raising a ladder against the wall, an English longbow arrow strikes her, piercing 6 inches deep between her neck and shoulder. Now, for any soldier, this is a devastating wound, probably a fatal one. The French troops start to hesitate, thinking their inspiration, their leader, is dead.
But she wasn't done. Just as the French commanders were about to sound the retreat for the day, Joan, after having the arrow pulled out of her body, returned to the battlefield. The commander Dunois himself testified that she came right up to him and begged him not to call off the attack, to try just one last push.
Inspired by seeing her back on her feet, the exhausted French troops rallied and launched one last, furious assault. The fortress of Les Tourelles fell. The English garrison was completely wiped out. The very next morning, the stunned English army packed up their things and just marched away. The siege was over.
That victory at Orléans was the turning point of the entire war. But for Joan, it was also the beginning of an incredibly swift and tragic journey from the highest point of victory to the ashes of martyrdom.
In the weeks that followed, Joan led the army to one stunning victory after another, and it all led to the coronation of Charles VII as the rightful king of France. She had done it. She fulfilled her promise. But her fortunes turned with shocking speed. Less than a year later, she was captured, sold to the English, and put on trial for heresy. On May 30th, 1431, just 2 years after her great triumph at Orléans, she was burned at the stake.
Her story, though, has one last twist. That first trial was a complete political sham run by her enemies to discredit her and the king that she put on the throne. But 25 years later, a new trial was opened. After interviewing over 100 witnesses who were still alive, the church overturned the whole thing, declared her a martyr, and condemned the original judges. Her name was clear. So who was she? A divinely inspired saint who performed miracles? Or was she a military genius with an unbelievable grasp of strategy and morale? You know, maybe the real answer is that you can't separate the two. Whatever the source of her power was, Joan of Arc is still this incredible figure who defied every single rule of her time to change the course of history.